Thank you for tuning in to Tamara for Georgia. I am Tamara Johnson Shealey, your candidate for the United States Senate. I'm an independent Democrat that believes that reparations will make America great. It is time that we unite our country once and for all. Please go to my website. It's tamaraforgeorgia.com. And please join me every Saturday, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, right here for Tamara for Georgia. All right. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Woo, can you believe we are 15 days into January? Let's pump our brakes. Time is moving way too fast. So good morning on this MLK weekend. You know who I have in the house, Mr. Reggie Jackson. Good morning, Mr. Jackson.
Good morning, Tamara. Good to be here with you on Martin Luther King's birthday.
I know. Look what they call you, Unc. Unc is back.
Oh,
Uncle
Unc. I look like somebody's uncle today, right? With all this gray hair.
It's okay, Mr. Reggie. Look at these grays popping out around my edges. So we in this together. That's wisdom, right? That's wisdom.
Absolutely.
We earn these gray hairs.
Yeah, no doubt about that.
How are you, sir?
I'm doing really well, Tamara. Life has been great for me so far in 2022. I'm, involved in some new ventures. Really excited about just everything that's going on in my life right now.
Amen. I'm excited too. We are riding high on this campaign trail, y'all. May 24th, 2022. May 24th, y'all. Look, we are needing all hands on deck right here, right now. Like all hands on deck. Let me just say this before we get started, Mr. Reggie. We have a fundraiser that we are trying to meet tonight, and we're just $1,000 short. 1,000, y'all. That's nothing. We can do this. Surely before midnight tonight, we can raise $1,000. So if you have not gone to the website, I am asking that you please go to the website. Please donate, volunteer, but donate tonight. Go to the website, Tamara for Georgia. So yes, Mr. Reggie, we are starting off full speed.
Oh yeah, absolutely. This is going to be a very important year for a lot of us. And, I know your campaign is just, man, it's on fire right now. So we got to keep the momentum going.
Yes. We got a race to win. We're taking all of this to Washington. All of these conversations, they are not in vain. These conversations, this is to really propel us in our fight for reparations. So I'm ready. Let's go.
All right.
Voting rights, Mr. Reggie. You and I talked. I was like, Mr. Reggie, what are we going to talk about? And it was MLK weekend. It was like, and voting rights we've been talking about this all over the country. Kamala Harris and Joe Biden came to Atlanta, and it was, voting rights, and it's on the table.
Right.
But you have some historical context that we need to dive into, not specific to where we are today, because I know that conversation can go anywhere.
Right.
But there's some historical context that we need to consider, and that's where you are the man to handle that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for most Americans, when they think about voting rights, particularly when it comes to Dr. King, they think about, the campaign and Bloody Sunday and Selma and how that, actually led up to the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But I always challenge people when it comes to the civil rights movement. I asked them a very simple question, Tamara. I said, why did we need a civil rights movement when we had the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution? Why years later, basically 100 years later, did we need a civil rights movement? And people are just like, I don't really know, because that doesn't make sense. If we got the right to vote in 1870, then why were we still fighting for the right to vote, 90, 95 years later? So I want to really go over some of that history with everybody today to kind of fill in the challenges we've had as a Black community to achieve the right to vote. And there's a lot of things that are part of the history that we're never taught in school. So I want to really go over that with everybody today.
I love these lessons with you, Mr. Reggie, because I can tell you, as when in growing up, history, I was able to remember what I needed to remember to pass the
Mhm.
test, but it
Mhm.
never resonated with me. Like, it didn't stick and stay. Like, I need to pass this test, so I'm gonna remember what I need to remember about this European history, because that's all it was. And that's, that's all, that's the magnitude of what most of us got in school. So these conversations that we have every third Saturday are so vital to us as a people. And even your history series, Mr. Reggie, and I'll let you mention that before you get started, but
Mhm.
even your history series that you host twice a month on the
Mhm.
Reparation Sunday, as a Reparation Sunday initiative. Speak to that and then dive in.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we're doing this series from January through May, where we're looking at kind of the history of what I call the devaluation of Black lives in American history, looking at the challenges that we faced. And so the first two sessions, we did the first session already, will be the next one this coming Wednesday, kind of looking at a broad look this coming Wednesday from 1866 to 2022, what's been going on with Black folks over that period of time. And then beginning in February, we're going to look more critically at the political system. And some of the things I'm going to share with you all today, we will share in more depth in that particular series in February. And then, we're going to talk about the criminal justice system. We're going to talk about the healthcare system, a lot of different systems, institutions within American history that have really devalued the lives of Black people. And people don't know the history, so they don't know how to articulate those arguments and understand that this history gives us all of the evidence we need to offer proof that reparations is absolutely not only due, but long overdue for Black folks in America.
Mhm, mhm. Absolutely. If you haven't gone to the website, please do reparationsunday.com/lecture series. Join us and be a part of this conversation. This is how we have the discussion, and this is the argument, because people sometimes want to debate you about why. But when you're armed and dangerous, they can't even dispute you. Like, they just, you can shut them down very easily. So thank you for all you do, Mr. Reggie.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a pleasure, and I love having a platform to share those things with folks. But when it comes to voting, I think I want to start by letting people know that when it comes to how voting works in this country, we have to go back to before the country was a country, when we were just, basically 13 colonies. And what people don't understand about that particular time in American history, before the Constitution was drawn up in 1787, you actually had a lot of free Blacks living in the country, in mostly the northern states. There were some in the southern states, but you had about, somewhere between 7 or 8% of Blacks in the country prior to the Constitution were free Blacks, right? And so you have to think about, well, what was their life like? What was it like to be a free Black in those northern states that had slavery at one time, but eventually got rid of it? What was it like? What rights did they have? In many cases, they were treated basically the same as those Blacks who were enslaved. I mean, they had a lot of restrictions on their movement, restrictions on things that white people would take for granted. But one of the things that you find by looking at the records from the constitutions drawn up by each of those colonies as they were moving towards creating, this United States, is that every one of those actually allowed Black people to vote, except for South Carolina. They were the only one that stipulated that only white people could vote. So, contrary to what most people believe, Black people voted prior to the Constitution being drawn up. And the people that were at the Constitutional Convention were taken from the legislatures of each of those colonies, right? And somebody voted them into office. And guess what? Black people were part of that body of people that voted these men into office. So these founding fathers that were at the Constitutional Convention, many of them received votes from Black people prior to the Constitution being drawn up. And I think that that's something that comes as a surprise to most people. People think that, well, Black people never had the right to vote till 1870 or whatever. But no, they had the right to vote. Black men in particular, women, it would be a very long battle for women to get the right to vote. But prior to the Constitution, every one of the colonies, except South Carolina, said it's okay for Black people to vote. So that's kind of interesting. So when we look at the Constitution, Most people have never read it and probably will never read it in very detail because, well, it's a pretty boring document for the most part. People don't like to read that kind of legalese and stuff of that nature. But one of the things that we find out with the Constitution is that they didn't really touch on voting rights because they said, listen, we're going to leave voting rights to the states. It will be determined by the states who can vote in those particular states. So that's really literally in the Constitution, that they're going to let the states determine who can vote. And years later, the federal government says we're going to have to step in and put some kind of parameters around that because we want to make sure that the states don't discriminate against people. But I'll get to that later. So when you think about the Constitution saying basically we're going to allow the states to control who can vote, okay, we continue to move forward. And eventually, as the United States is formed, some of those states decide, well, you know what? We don't really want Black people to vote anymore. We don't really want Black men to vote anymore. And I like to use the example of the state that I live in now, Wisconsin. So Wisconsin, their first constitution in 1848, they ruled that Black men will not have the right to vote. So 1848, Wisconsin said Black men can't vote in their state constitution. And they joined, many other states that had actually changed and said, we're going to not allow Black men to vote. So what's happened in Wisconsin is they put a referendum on the ballot and said, this isn't fair. Let's let the citizens of Wisconsin decide whether or not Black men should have the right to vote. And so this ballot referendum passed overwhelmingly, Tamara. Overwhelming. I mean, it wasn't even close. They said, yeah, Black men should have the right to vote. And so what happens is everybody was excited. Yeah, Black men had the right to vote. But what happens, somebody challenged it in court. It went all the way to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Eventually, Wisconsin Supreme Court would chime in on this later. But when Black men went to register to vote, they weren't allowed to register to vote. And the Wisconsin Elections Commission said, okay, this ballot referendum, okay, it looks like it worked. But, in the next election after that referendum, they said that, listen, most people who voted in the election, they voted for the governor, but they skipped the referendum on Black men's voting rights. So because most people didn't vote on that, we're going to just pretend like it never happened. That's literally what the State Elections Commission said, because not everybody voted on it, even though it won overwhelmingly, because most people didn't vote on it. We're going to just skip it. And so what ends up happening, Black men didn't have the right to vote, even after they were supposed to have the right to vote. And then they put other ballot referendums on, and all of those eventually failed. Eventually, a Black man by the name of Ezekiel Gillespie in Milwaukee said, wait a minute, something is wrong with this. Let me challenge this. Went to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and they looked and they said, wait a minute. So this ballot referendum gave Black men the right to vote, but then you never gave them the right to vote. You never allowed them to register to vote and to vote. They said that's not right, and they gave Black men the right to vote. And it was 30 years between the time the first Black man voted and the second Black man voted in elections in Wisconsin. So that was the way it was around the country. So now we look like, okay, we're getting into the years of the Civil War, right? So we fight this bloody war, for 4 years. The most horrific war in American history. And part of what we don't learn about it is Black men fought in the Civil War. In fact, I always like to say, now that I know this for sure, now that I've studied my family's history and know for sure, that my great-grandfather's great-grandfather was 53 years old, joined the Union Army in 1863, and fought for the Union Army. So he fought for the cause of his own freedom and that of his family and friends and everybody else. And we had, almost 200,000 Black men that served in the Union Army and Navy and helped win the war. Had it not been for that, the Civil War would have probably been lost by the Union. So the turn of the tide, those 300,000 or 200,000 Black men helped turn the tide of the war. And that eventually led to 1870, where the Congress passed the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which gave Black men the right to vote. Okay, so basically this is what it said. That Constitutional Amendment didn't necessarily give Black men the right to vote. What it said was that states cannot abridge that right to vote based on color or race, right? So they basically said the states can't pass some law that takes the right to vote away from Black men. So that's kind of the way the 15th Amendment was written. And so, of course, we know that when people don't like the way a law is written, they try to find a workaround, right? So what ends up happening is there will be workarounds later. But initially, it was a shock to the system for white people in the South. Like, wait a minute, wait. We were just enslaving these people yesterday. Now today, all of a sudden, they are free And then, 5 years later, now you've given these black men the right to vote. That's not right. These people are illiterate. They have all of these issues, blah, blah, blah. And they basically just, chastise people for even thinking about giving black men the right to vote. But this is where it came from, though, Tamir. Abraham Lincoln, shortly before he was assassinated, he was so proud of those black men that served in the Union Army and Navy that he said, listen, we should think about, and this, he's talking to Congress, he said, we should think about giving these men the right to vote that served in the Union Army and Navy. We should think about that, because he said, I think they deserve that based on them, fighting for the Union. They deserve the right to vote. And guess what? When he made that statement publicly, John Wilkes Booth was listening. And John Wilkes Booth basically said that was the moment where he decided he was going to kill Abraham Lincoln, because he was going to have the audacity to give black men the right to vote. That's when he decided, I'm going to kill that man. So people don't know that history of how Abraham Lincoln, speaking about giving those black soldiers only, just the ones who fought in the Army and Navy, the right to vote, would be a really, really important part of him being assassinated. So now we have 1870, February 3rd, 1870, the 15th Amendment passes. Black men are given the right to vote. And guess what? It was not like what we were taught in school, like, oh yeah, black men got the right to vote, and all these black men were in Congress and in state legislatures. It didn't work like that, Tamara. There weren't a whole lot of blacks who were elected to office. In fact, even though they were majority of the population in a couple of states in the South, they never amounted to more than about 1/4 of all members of state legislatures in the South, right? But we did see some extraordinary things happen, though. We saw PBS Pinchback in Louisiana become the first black governor in the country, which is amazing, right? He was appointed because the former governor had been removed from office, and he replaced. So he became the first black governor in Louisiana, which sounds wonderful, right, Tamir? That sounds great. First black governor. Woohoo! But guess what? It only lasted for 30 days and then he was gone, right? So, we marked that on the calendar. We talk about that in Black History Month. The first black governor was PBS Pinchback. We're like, yeah, but we don't tell people that, yeah, it only lasts for 30 days though. So, we celebrate things. I always tell people to stop celebrating stuff until you know the details of it, because it really ain't worthy of celebrating if the man only lasted for a month. But then you had Hiram Revels, who was appointed to the Senate seat, which had been vacated by Jefferson Davis. Y'all know who Jefferson Davis is? President of the Confederacy. He, when the Confederate States broke away, his seat was vacated in the U.S. Senate. He was a U.S. Senator prior to the Civil War. So Hiram Revels from Mississippi actually was appointed to Jefferson Davis' former seat. So he was the first black member of the U.S. Senate. Hiram Revels from Mississippi, right? And so these are like big things. These are significant things. Black men are now out there voting or attempting. But this is what happens, Samira. People don't want them to vote. So you start to have massive, massive levels of anti-black violence around the country, trying to intimidate black people into not registering to vote, into not voting, in addition to the fact that people were using massive doses of violence to prevent them from having economic success as well. Black people started to be beat, killed, black women raped, black girls raped. I mean, it was just a horrific time for black people. When we think about Reconstruction and we think about the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, we think that was a really good time for blacks, but it was a period of massive anti-black violence, including the Ku Klux Klan, which formed in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1865. Those former Confederate soldiers got together and said, oh, let's create this club, right? The Ku Klux Klan. And, they tried to tell everybody it was just a club of good old boys, having a good time and finding common bonds of things that they enjoyed. But really what it was about was that they were the first organized terrorist group in the United States of America. And one of their aims was to prevent black people who had gotten the right to, citizenship with the 1868 14th Amendment to the Constitution, but the 13th Amendment gave them freedom. They said, we don't want them to enjoy those freedoms. And those freedoms would eventually include the freedom to have the right to vote And so the Ku Klux Klan was really about, no, we're not going to let that happen. The Knights of the White Camellia was another important one of those terrorist groups as well. So Black people had the right to vote beginning in 1870, but it wasn't something that they were stable in, right? You had massive violence around the South. And what ends up happening is that, we have to fight tooth and nail to maintain the right to vote. And so one of the things that happens is, many of your audience members have probably heard the famous ballot or the bullet speech by Malcolm X, right? But Malcolm X stole that idea. You know who he stole the idea from, Tamara? Who he stole the idea for the ballot or the bullet speech from? You have any idea? He stole it from Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass wrote a speech called The Ballot and the Bullet. In 1859, he wrote this article about it. And he said, listen, if Blacks don't receive the right to vote in the way that we should, in totality, by ending slavery and giving us that right to vote, then it's going to be some bullets that's going to start flying. So he was literally predicting the Civil War. He said that the only way you're going to get to this point is some bullets are going to have to fly. So he actually wrote that article in 1859. So he had a crystal ball. He knew, well, it was pretty obvious people that this war was going to break out. So Black people are voting before the 15th Amendment. 15th Amendment opens it up even much wider, and the violence becomes much, much more perceptive around the country. So one of the things that happens is Congress passes this law in 1870 called the Enforcement Act. And the Enforcement Act is critically important when it comes to these voting rights. They basically say that, listen, we know that there are people that don't want to give Black people a right to vote, but we're going to put a mechanism in place that punishes people who try to prevent Black people from voting. So this Enforcement Act was passed after the 15th Amendment. So 15th Amendment said, okay, people have a right to vote. You can't abridge it as a state in state law. But the Enforcement Act says, we know y'all going to try to do it anyway. So we're going to put this law into place that says, if you try to interfere, we're going to punish you. We're going to try you. And we're going to give you a $5,000 fine and 6 months in prison if you try to prevent Black people from voting. So it's like, okay, great. Congress has passed this wonderful new law. It's going to protect Black people. But guess what? I always tell people this, Tamara. Laws don't mean anything if you don't enforce them. And this law was never really enforced in the way that it could, because you had people in the South who had formerly enslaved 4 million Black people for the entire period from 1619 to 1865. Blacks were enslaved. And so now you expect these folks who had enslaved us to all of a sudden say, okay, we're not going to bridge the right of these Black men to vote. No, that was not going to happen. So the Enforcement Act had to be passed to protect it. And that's something that's generally not taught to us about in history class. So you have the 15th Amendment, you have the Enforcement Act, everything should be all right, right? Everything should be good. But no, it wasn't. You had constant perversions of the law by white people continuing to beat and kill Black men. And probably one of the most horrific acts of violence against Blacks during this time period related to voting specifically was called the Colfax Massacre. If you haven't heard of it, in 1873 in Louisiana, Colfax, Louisiana, I'm not going to get into the details of it, but it was an effort by whites to prevent Blacks from even having the discussion about pursuing, larger and larger measures of Blacks getting registered and voting in elections. So they were just having a conversation about it, and they were attacked in this Colfax Massacre in 1873. Look it up, Google it, whatever you need to do. It's one of those the really moments in American history that we don't learn about that was critically important. And so most people don't know that, like Lincoln, this Republican Party that Lincoln was a part of, and you had the Democratic Party, right? So what happens is the Democrats who were in Congress after those states that had seceded rejoined the Union. The Democrats in Congress did not want to promote the rights of Blacks, right? They fought tooth and nail. The Republicans were in support of Blacks having these rights. And so they constantly supported, Black rights, and they did everything they could to support that. But guess what? The violence got to be so extreme that in 1871, they passed the Ku Klux Klan Act, which literally outlawed the Ku Klux Klan in the United States of America. So remember that. Ku Klux Klan was outlawed in 1871. Tamir, let me ask you a question. Does the Ku Klux Klan still exist?
Yeah.
Curious, right?
Yeah.
They outlawed in 1871. Here we are in 2022, and last time I checked, they still around. So that's why I say, laws don't mean anything if you're not enforcing them. So okay, so now they hope that law would quell the violence against blacks who were attempting to vote, that they would stop killing black folks just because they were registering to vote, just because they were voting, just because they were advocating that, people vote. Well, guess what? It didn't happen because they never really enforced it. And so you continue to have all of this violence. And then you begin to see, as Reconstruction ended, and Reconstruction ended in 1876, 1877, because of a disputed election, a disputed presidential election. Because of the way the Electoral College works, you have to receive a certain number of electors to be elected to Congress. So in that election of 1876, neither of the major party candidates had enough votes in the Electoral College to actually win. Right? They were both short. And so it ended up going to the House of Representatives. They battled back and forth to determine which one of these men, Tilden or Hayes, would be, the next U.S. president. And so there were all of these arguments back and forth about it. And finally, they came to a compromise, and they decided that they were going to allow Rutherford B. Hayes to become the president of the United States. And, interestingly enough, one of the states where the votes were disputed was Florida. Does that sound kind of familiar to you, Tamara? Disputed election in Florida? Disputed presidential election in Florida? Sounds like we've heard that before, right? So Rutherford B. Hayes became the president. And, that was basically the end of Reconstruction, the end of any attempts to help Black people in the South. And what happens after that is like, man, massive doses of violence begin to grow. This is when we began to see Black people not just beat and kill, but also lynched in large measure. After Reconstruction ends, you start to see Black people go and try to register to vote. And then, the day later, they're hanging from a tree. So lynching becomes a very paramount tool of people who want to prevent Blacks from voting. And then that Republican Party that had been such a strong supporter of Black people against the Democratic Party, guess what? They began to turn their backs on Blacks. And this is why they did it, Tamir. They began to understand that in elections in the North, in New York City, in Ohio, and other places, that because they are advocating for the rights of Black people, that they're, Black people in the South, because that's where most Black people live, because the Republican Party is advocating for those rights, guess what? It starts to impact elections in the North. Republicans start to lose elections or lose power in elections. They see their numbers decrease dramatically because they are supporting the rights of Black people in the South. So the Republican Party says, wait a minute, man. Listen, what we know, we've been supporting Blacks. We've been supporting their right to vote because we think this is critically important. It's helped us win elections in the South. But man, now it's impacting our elections in the North in a negative way, because these white folks in the North, contrary to what people want to believe about, the bad people, the racist people were in the South. They were in the North too. These racist white people in the North said, well, as long as you guys are talking about helping the Negro in the South, we're not going to vote for the Republican Party anymore. So what did the Republican Party do? They flip the switch and they say, okay, we're going to stop supporting Black rights to vote and all of these other measures that have been put in place. So literally from the time that Reconstruction ended, through the next 20, 30 years, the Democratic and Republican Party are basically the same party when it comes to Black folks. They're not going to do anything to help support Black people, particularly not when it comes to voting rights. And the Republican Party stops trying to pass measures that mitigate the damage done by people preventing Black people from voting in the South. So now you have two major parties. You Black people, you're looking like neither of the major parties is doing anything to protect our voting rights anymore. So what happens? Now, remember, the 15th Amendment said that states couldn't pass laws that abridged the right to vote based on race, right? So guess what? People said, okay, let's see if we can figure out a way to write a colorblind measure that they'll basically make it so the Black people can't vote. So then you began to have in 1890 what's called the Mississippi Plan. Most people never heard of the Mississippi Plan. Part of the Mississippi Plan was that the state government of Mississippi said, we're going to launch a new constitutional convention to draw up a new constitution for the state of Mississippi. And they said that, it literally said this, Tamara, literally said this out loud, that the express aim of this convention is for us to figure out how to legally remove Black people from the voting rolls. We're going to figure out some measures to put in place that will prevent a lot of Black people from voting. So they became, they started things like the literacy test, poll taxes, grandfather clause. Now, think about this grandfather clause. The grandfather clause said that if your grandfather was able to vote, think about this, Tamara. If your grandfather was able to vote prior to 1865, then you have the right to vote. But guess what? For Black folks, those Black folks in Mississippi, their grandfathers were mostly all enslaved. So guess what? You can't vote because your grandfather couldn't vote before the 15th Amendment to the Constitution gave your grandfather the right to vote. So it's a very sneaky way of getting around the law. And of course, they did it in a legal way. They didn't violate the 15th Amendment. They simply put a barrier in place. Poll taxes, literacy testing, grandfather clause. They even had passed something in multiple states, Tamara, that was called the all-white primary. Now, think about this. You never had primary elections in the United States until the late 1800s. You just had elections, like, right? So around here in Wisconsin, we're going to be having a primary election next month for the new mayor of Milwaukee, and then we'll have the general election in April, right? But you didn't have any primary elections because they weren't necessary. So the primary election system in the United States was created as a way to make sure Black people couldn't vote. And what it was is they created what they call the all-white primary, which basically said that if you want to vote, we're going to create this primary election, but the only people eligible to vote in those primary elections are white people. So it's little like, wait a minute, something's wrong with this. This doesn't make any sense. But it didn't violate, according to courts, it didn't violate the 15th Amendment. So you had that barrier. So you had all of these barriers put in place. Alabama in 1901 said, oh, we love that Mississippi plan. Let's do the same thing. They had a constitutional convention and they put poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, all white primaries in place. So literally when Mississippi came up with this wonderful plan to find a way to legally prevent Black people from voting, a bunch of other states said, we're going to do the same thing. Georgia did. South Carolina did, Texas did, Oklahoma did. We don't think of Oklahoma as being part of the South, but man, they were literally just like the southern states. So you had all of these different states that said, we're going to follow Mississippi's plan and we're going to put these processes into place. So now Black people are like, wait a minute. Not only do we no longer have the support of the Republican or Democratic Party when it comes to voting rights, but now we have these states that are run by Democrats that are literally putting in place measures to prevent us from voting, right? Now, so think about this literacy test. They're going to say, you need to be able to read a part of the Constitution and then talk to this person who you're trying to register to vote with. You're going to have to answer some questions related to the Constitution, right? Or you're going to have to literally memorize the Constitution so that you can say the Constitution, the full Constitution, back to this person to prove that you're literate enough to actually be able to vote. So these are some of the tests they give you, right? Like, okay, I want you to recite the whole Constitution, Tamara. Can you do that, Tamara? Today, can you recite the entire U.S. Constitution word for word without making a mistake? Can you do that?
No. I don't know nobody who can.
I know I can't, and I know the Constitution really well, but I know I'd be tripped up in the first couple paragraphs already, right? But this was one of the things. So you're a Black person, you're trying to vote, and you're going in like, okay, so recite the Constitution for me there, Tamara. Oh, you can't do it? Oh, sorry, Tamara, you don't pass the literacy test. Like, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. But that's the ways that they prevented Black people from voting. And the poll tax. Now, this is one of the interesting parts of the poll tax. Now, the poll tax said that if you want to register to vote, you have to pay this poll tax. Now, it wasn't a whole lot of money, but it was a lot of money for people that didn't have any money, right? Or had very little money. So that was a barrier that not only prevented Black people from voting, Tamara, but it prevented a whole boatload of poor white people from voting, because the people who were elected to office, were generally people who were financially successful in some measure. And they looked at like, well, these poor people, they're not really very smart. They shouldn't have a right to vote because they're illiterate, blah, 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 all these things they said. So they literally disenfranchised a whole bunch of poor black folks and a bunch of poor white folks at the same time. And so what could poor people do about that? It was really nothing they could do about it. They couldn't prevent this from happening. So for many, many years, you had these things happening and people trying to figure out, what do we do about this? What can we do to turn the tide and gain voting rights? And so now you're getting into the early 1900s. And you have a monumental event that happens in Springfield, Illinois in 1908. You have what's known as the Springfield Race Riot. And this is one of the early 1900 race riots, anti-Black race riots, where hundreds of people were killed, injured, businesses destroyed. You know, people know about what happened in Tulsa, right? In 1921. Springfield, Illinois was in 1908. So it preceded Tulsa by over a decade. And what ends up happening because of what happened in Springfield, you have a group of people that got together to form the NAACP the same year the Springfield race riot, right? Anti-Black race riot. So the NAACP, once they start doing what they do, is they said, listen, we're going to start fighting to end Jim Crow laws. But one of the areas that they said, we're going to try to defeat some of these measures put in place to prevent Black people from voting. We're going to try to get rid of the poll tax. We're going to try to get rid of literacy tests. We're going to try to get rid of the all-white primary. We're going to try to get rid of the grandfather clause, all of these different things. That's some of the early work that they began to work on. And people generally don't know that. So they start to do this really quickly. And one of the first ones that they had success with was that grandfather clause. They were able to go to court and go all the way to U.S. Supreme Court and defeat the grandfather clause. They eventually were able to defeat the literacy test. They never could defeat the poll tax in court, though. But years later, the poll tax would actually be eliminated by an act of Congress, an amendment to the Constitution. So here we are in the early 1900s. And you know what's going on with women, right? What are women doing at this time when it comes to voting, Tamara? What are the women doing around the country?
We weren't voting.
Right. So what did they do? They said they won't let us vote. So what are we going to do? What did the women do?
Did they protest?
They protested around the country, and these women are known as suffragettes. Now, the suffragette movement, which was the movement of women to get the right to vote, started in 1800s. You know, they were like, wait a minute. So you passed this amendment in 1870 that gives Black men to vote. Right. But what about women? Right. What about Black women? Because Black women were like, wait, hold on. 1870, you're giving Black men the right to vote, but not us. You know, why aren't women getting the right to vote? So women began to agitate for the right to vote in the suffragette movement, which in almost every history book you read, Tamara, you read about the suffragette movement, and they got, you know, a whole, you know, several pages worth of information about it. And they tell you about, you know, Katie Stanton and all of these different white women. They never tell you the Black women were part of the suffragette movement. And one of the primary people that was a part of that was Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells was like, wait a minute. Y'all talking about white women getting the right to vote. What about Black women? We deserve the right to vote too. So these Black suffragettes push and push and push. The white suffragettes push and push and push. And there was a great deal of violence against these women, Tamara. It's just, you know, this is what I tell people, like, violence is as American as apple pie. You use violence to get anything you want in America. And to prevent women from voting, men literally were beating the crap out of women who tried to protest for the right to vote. And so when they finally got enough momentum to build up to 1920, when the Constitutional Amendment gave women the right to vote, and they were celebrating that, right? They were going to have this big march, you know, to celebrate it. And guess what they told Ida B. Wells? Guess what they told her? Miss Ida B. Wells, well, listen, you Black, and you can't march at the front of this rally with the rest of us. You know, we all suffragettes, and you know, okay, y'all did your part, y'all Black women did your part, but listen, you gonna have to get at the end of the line in this big parade, this celebration. And you know what Ida B. Wells told these women? Tamara, you want to guess what she said?
She gave them the middle finger.
She gave them both middle fingers. She said,
I like her.
She said, no. This not gonna play out the way y'all think it is. Y'all going to start marching, and y'all gonna see me later, right? So they marching and stuff, and they all celebrating and smiling. And next thing you know, they looking on the sidewalk. It's like they go, Ida B. Wells. She done walked up the sidewalk. She done jumped into the front of the line with them. They like, what in the hell are you doing? And she's like, I'm celebrating the same way y'all celebrating. So the role that Black suffragettes played was critically important, but it's never talked about in our history books. So Black women now have forced, the same way white women have forced men to give them the right to vote. So this is 1920. So like 1870, black men got the right to vote. 1920, women got the right to vote. But guess which group had been left out of even citizenship rights? Native Americans. Native Americans, when they were passing, the 14th Amendment to give citizenship rights to blacks, they were arguing whether or not they're going to give citizenship rights to Native Americans, who were the original people here, right? But they said, no, we're not going to include them. So Native Americans didn't become citizens until 1924, and they became eligible to vote in 1924. So, I mean, this is just a crazy history when you think about it. So here we are now in the 1920s. And you think, okay, we're working on getting rid of the poll taxes, literacy tests, whatever, and we continue to see anti-Black violence around the country. You see a major anti-Black race riot in Atlanta in 1906. You see this one in Springfield, Illinois, like I mentioned, in 1908. 1917, East St. Louis, Illinois, one of the bloodiest anti-Black race riots in American history occurs. A lot of Black GIs were literally killed in their uniforms in East St. Louis. So, the World War I ends in 1919. Black GIs come back like, listen, we've been fighting for freedom, democracy, all of these things that we're going to demand those things in the United States when we get back. So they come back and they're like, we're going to demand this, and we're going to listen, y'all going to have to get rid of these rules that's preventing us from voting and all of this other stuff. And guess what? They get shot down in the street. They get murdered across the country. In 1919, it's known as Red Summer. James Weldon Johnson called it that because it was the bloodiest summer in American history when it came to Black folks and anti-Black violence. You had, 24 major anti-Black race riots around the country. You had a huge one in Chicago. One of the biggest was in Elaine, Arkansas. Some Black farmers who had been getting together to demand their rights. You had all of these from the East Coast to the West Coast, from the North to the South, anti-Black race riots, which none of these were talked about in our history classes. And even, last year when people heard about what happened in Tulsa, it's like how horrible it was in Tulsa. All of these Black people killed, 35 square blocks destroyed, and, documentaries and TV shows talking about Tulsa. It's like, they didn't mention that 2 years before Tulsa, you had 24 of these riots that were very similar to what happened in Tulsa. So you have this anti-Black violence, which continues to occur. And part of the reason it doesn't stop is because Black people don't have the right to vote to put measures into place to continue to protect themselves. So this is why I tell people that what we were fighting for, the NAACP and other groups were fighting for, was the right to vote so that we could at least be in the room to make decisions about protecting ourselves. In particular, one of the things that Blacks were advocating for in terms of voting rights, they wanted Congress to pass an anti-lynching bill because lynchings were occurring across the country. Like I said, when Black people went to try to vote, next day, somebody found them hanging, in the middle of town from a tree or some other thing, right? They had been killed because not only were they attempting to vote, but they were attempting to tell other Black people that you should try to register to vote too. You have a right to vote, and all of a sudden they're going to be lynched. So you have from really when they start keeping stats on lynchings from the late 1870s, all the way through 1960, you have about 5,000 documented lynchings of Black people across the United States of America. And a lot of it was related directly to people attempting to vote or attempting to advocate for voting rights for Blacks because they wanted to, the House of Representatives passed the Dyer Act, but you have to have both houses of Congress pass it before it becomes federal law. So the Senate never passed an anti-lynching law, Tamara, never passed it. Despite all of this attempts by Black people across the country to push for it and push for it and push for it, they never did. And in fact, in 2005, they formally apologized for never passing an anti-lynching law in the U.S. Senate. And my mentor, Dr. James Cameron, the founder of America's Black Holocaust Museum, man who had survived a lynching at the age of 16 in 1930, was there in the chambers of Congress when they passed this measure saying, we apologize for never passing anti-lynching law, right? And this shows you how deceptive those things can be. When he came back from Washington, D.C., I talked to him about, Dr. Cameron, what was it like to be there? And, they made this proclamation, blah, 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 whatever. He said it was a farce, Reggie. He said it was fake. He said it was only a couple senators that were even in the room. He said, when I was there, I'm thinking it's going to be the full chamber. All the senators are going to be there. you know. But he says it was just a handful of them. Barack Obama was one of the ones that was there, but it was just a handful of U.S. senators there when they passed this proclamation saying, yeah, we apologize for never passing an anti-lynching law. And all over the news, the Senate apologizes for never, you know, but it was fake. It was fake. So Dr. Cameron talked about that. And I always say to people that, listen, the failure of the federal government to pass an anti-lynching law really continued to impact Blacks' ability to gain the right to vote, because by World War I ending and Blacks, you know, being the victims of massive violence, it continued into the years of World War II. Also, anti-Black race riots around the country in Detroit, in Philadelphia, in Baltimore, in multiple cities around the country. We're continuing to face the same levels of violence, and it's never talked about in our history classes. So now let's move forward, Tamara. Now we're in the period where the civil rights movement is in full swing, right? You know, Emmett Till has been murdered in Mississippi, 37 miles from where I was born. You had the Brown versus Board of Education decision passed by the Supreme Court in 1954, but not really enforced because the state said, screw you, Supreme Court. They literally gave the Supreme Court two middle fingers and said, we're not going to enforce it. And so Blacks are like, listen, we got to get the right to vote so that we can make sure that these things are in place so that we can have these rights. And we want to get rid of Jim Crow laws and all these other things. So Black people are going to try to register to vote. And this is when you begin to see the third iteration of the Ku Klux Klan. So the original Ku Klux Klan in 1865 was outlawed in 1871. They came back alive right before World War I started in 1915, right there in Stone Mountain, Georgia, down in your neck of the woods, Tamara. The Klan was reborn, and they continued to be just as violent as the original Klan was against Black people, killing Black people, beating Black people who were attempting to vote, to register to vote, to advocate for people to register to vote. That was a big part of what the Klan was about. So now you have another one that says, oh, now Black people have gotten together to try to defeat Jim Crow and some of these other, you know, our way of life, as these people said it. They're trying to defeat our way of life. And so they became very violent, and they started to beat Black people around the South. And so now you have Dr. King, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, all of these different groups are now down in Alabama saying, listen, we're going to use Selma, Alabama as a stepping off point to prove that we need to get the state of Alabama to allow Black people to have the right to vote freely and openly without all of these measures in place that are preventing them from registering to vote. And what happens? We all saw it. We've seen the video of Bloody Sunday. We saw John Lewis get trampled by those state troopers. We saw Black men, you know, men, women, young people, elderly members of our community get run over by horses, get beat unmercifully by those state troopers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge there in Selma, Alabama. And it was because they simply wanted the right to vote, Tamara. People in state government, George Wallace, you know, whose most famous words were segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, sent those state troopers there to beat the living daylights out of those peaceful Black protesters, completely unarmed people who simply wanted to march from Selma to Montgomery, to the courthouse in Montgomery, and say, we deserve to have all of these, you know, barriers that are in the way of us voting eliminated. And that's what it was about. Bloody Sunday, they beat the living daylights out of these people. Eventually, you know, they continued to march and they continued to advocate for these changes. And so you began to have Black people across the country saying, listen, we're going to start registering Black people to vote. Now, everybody on your show, Tamara, I'm sure is familiar with the Black Panther Party, right? But what they don't know is that the original Black Panther Party was not out there in Oakland, California. You know where the original Black Panther Party was, Tamara? Do you have any idea where it was from?
Some southern state, Mississippi or something, Alabama, some southern state, right?
Lowndes County, Alabama.
Alabama.
There was a political party that was created called the Black Panther Party in Lowndes County, Alabama, was the original Black Panther Party. And the guys in Oakland stole the name. They're like, oh, that's a cool name. We like that name. We're going to use that name. But what these folks in Lowndes County, Alabama did was say, we're going to start registering Black people to vote. We don't care what's going on. We're not going to allow people to continue to prevent us from having a right that we have. We're going to fight back against that. So they started this political party to advocate for Black voting rights. And of course, you know, white people in the South were you know, saying, okay, y'all can go in and try it, but it's not going to be successful. So now I moved back to my home state of Mississippi. 1964, that freedom summer, right? Where all of these people come from around the country, do-gooders from around the country come to Mississippi to help with the voter registration drive in Mississippi. And we know it didn't end well for many people, but this is the part of the story that we're never told. Like, listen, it didn't start in 1964. Black people in Mississippi have been advocating for the right to vote and been trying to register people to vote for a very long, for decades. And it just kind of like in 1964, some people decided they were going to come from New York and Philadelphia and, you know, all these other places around the country. They would come to help. White people in particular came down to help. And we saw what happened in 1964. We saw that, you know, these three civil rights workers, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, were murdered by the police and the Ku Klux Klan in Mississippi simply because they were there to help Black people register to vote. We saw also Fannie Lou Hamer. Now, if your audience doesn't know Fannie Lou Hamer, they better do some research on this woman, because this is one of the most fabulous women that's ever lived in this country. Fannie Lou Hamer lived not too far from where I lived in Mississippi. She was one of the leaders of the voting rights campaign in Mississippi. And as a result of that, this woman was beaten unmercifully. Now, this is what happened. They were leading this protest, and the police arrested all of these Black folks, and they had them in this terrible jail. And the police literally came in and they told these Black men, listen, that we're going to give you this weapon. So they gave them, you know, some weapons, and they said, we want you to beat this woman. So this old Black woman, Fannie Lou Hamer, they literally forced these Black men at gunpoint to beat the living daylights out of this woman. So Fannie Lou Hamer suffered one of the most brutal beatings you can imagine, simply because she had been advocating for Black people to vote. They beat the living daylights out of her. But this was a woman who led what was called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And think about this, Tamara. Black people said, okay, we have the right to vote. They put these measures in place to prevent us from voting, but we literally do, under law, have the right to vote. So because they haven't allowed us the right to vote, those people that were elected to Congress in 1964 election from Mississippi were illegitimately elected. And they said, we're going to form the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party because we, the Black people, if we had been allowed to vote like we should have been, we would have been, in many cases, electing the people that would have been elected to Congress in Mississippi. So they literally went to the 1964 Democratic Convention, and they argued that those people that are here representing Mississippi, those people are illegitimate. They were illegitimately elected. They don't represent the whole of Mississippi because they don't represent any of the Black folks in Mississippi. We do. Therefore, we should be put in the place of these people at the Democratic National Convention. And the Democratic National Convention people are like really upset, like, oh my goodness, you know, this is causing a lot of turmoil at the convention. We can't allow this to happen. So basically what they said is that we're going to make a compromise. They can say, we're going to acknowledge that you're probably right, but we're going to continue to allow those people to be seated, and we're not going to seat you people. Y'all get out of here. And that was kind of, you know, a turning point. Black people like, okay, we got to do something. And then, of course, Bloody Sunday happens. You see shortly after that, Congress began to debate in earnest 1965 Voting Rights Act, which basically said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to prevent some of these policies and practices from being constitutional anymore. And we're going to punish those states that have been refusing Black people a right to vote. So Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was the most important piece, because it said if you have a history of discriminating against Black people, abridging their right to vote, then we're going to not allow you to pass any voting laws on the state level unless they go through the Department of Justice on the federal level and they give you the approval to do so. So from 1965 all the way to 2013, that protection was there in place. It was in place, Tamara. But then a case in 2013, some people sued in a case called Shelby County, Alabama, versus the federal government, based against Holder, Holder, who was the the director of the Department of Justice under Barack Obama, and they won in their case in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, "Oh, listen, we know that this has been in place to prevent these southern states from discriminating against Black people." But they were like, "Oh, but it's 2013. Those states aren't discriminating against Black people anymore. We ain't got to worry about it. We can do away with Section 5 because those states, come on, they're not bad anymore. This isn't 1965 anymore. Those states are going to do right by Black people." And so they did away with Section 5. And literally the next day, the first state in the country to pass a new voting law was the state of Texas, which put some barriers in place for Black people to vote. So it's been a constant struggle, Tamara. Constant, never-ending struggle.
And it continues. And it continues today. Unabated today. Oh my gosh. We just, it just shows our resilience as a people. We don't stop. We don't quit. And every generation of us is more and more empowered. And I was in a Twitter space just yesterday, and I was talking to a bunch of 20, 30-year-olds. And I like that generation because they're very informed. The information is readily available. They ask questions. They push back. And like every generation, I believe, keeps getting stronger and stronger. And America is this is reckoning time. And we're just not going to stop. And I believe, and there's something you said too, I believe there's more of us than they want to say. Like when you just said that early on, and when you were talking about the plan, I don't know, it just came in my head, like all these slaves and just these slave owners, it was hundreds and hundreds and thousands of slaves per slave owner or slave owning family. I always believe that there was always more of us than they want us to know. Yeah. Mr. Reggie, you are always a wealth of knowledge. I enjoy you. I'm sure that the audience does too. The chat just goes crazy. I thank you for being here for all of us and all the great work that you do. You are truly appreciated, sir.
Well, thank you, Tamara. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with your audience. Love your audience and look forward to the next time, Tamara.
Yes. He says, thanks, Brother Reggie, for the history lesson. Absolutely. Thank you, sir. All right. We'll see you back here next Saturday. I'll see you back here next Saturday, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Have a great week, everybody.
When we come to Washington in this campaign, we're coming to get our check. Young prodigies. Get out. Free.
Reparations, Martin said we coming for our check. Reparations, say it loud, 1, 2, mic check. Cream, cash rules everything around me. Dream, my legacy, you can't stop me. Coming for our 40 acres, HR 40 and our paper.
Kicking the door, coming for our 40 acres and more. I'm 6.4 trillion. Miss that no, we fought the Civil War.
We came from the poor.
Start from the bottom, we still on the floor. We pray to the Lord.
Amen.
Picking the cotton, our fingers are sore.
Straight out the underground, escaping from slavery. The only cemeteries that we had were the trees. Watching our bodies while they glue in the breeze. Niggas to the north side to get free.
That way came from slavery. Where's all the men want to stay on me? Put her head on the door, but the world won't scheme. Stick to the north side to get free.
Reparations, Martin said we coming for our check. Reparations, say it loud, 1, 2, mic check. Cream, cash rules everything around me. Dream, my legacy, you can't stop me. Coming for our 40 acres, HR 40 and our paper.
We taking them back. Putting Pettis Bridge on the map. Police came with the strap. That Sunday was buddy, no cap. Speaking of cap, Kaepernick taking knees at the flag. Where my justice at? We built this nation, better give me them racks. All fat, just imagine a little bit of gasoline. 4 girls got burned back in 63.
400 years, yeah, we still ain't free. Our rise, we rise, taking it.
Kaepernick. Reparations, Martin said we coming for our check. Reparations, say it loud, 1, 2, mic check. Cream, cash rules everything around me. Dream, my legacy, you can't stop me.
Coming for our 40 acres, HR 40 and our paper.
We stuck in the trap with no shoes, trying to pull up bootstraps. Increasing the gap. Wealth got bigger, so we had to adapt. Discriminated cause we black. I know it worth more than I know it's a fact. They tryna feel scraps. Strike me on board so we can't come back.
30 years ago on April 19, Yusef and Triremi chemical read.
If it happened to them, think it happened to me. It's criminals already 5 to a free.
Prodigy.
Reparation.